Chapter 6. Mason. Mason smiled as he brushed a strand of hair from Clara's face. Her lips curled into a smile, and she opened her mouth to speak. Instead of sweet words, though, the noise that came out of her mouth was an annoying beeping sound. Mason looked around to see where the noise was coming from, but when his gaze came back to Clara, she was gone. With a sigh, he realized the offensive noise was his alarm clock, and his time with Clara had been nothing but a dream. He slapped the snooze button on the alarm and slowly opened his eyes. He hadn't dreamed about Clara in years, yet she'd visited him nightly since Friday. It had to be because she now worked for his team, and though they had yet to have a meaningful face-to-face conversation, he had managed to score a little time with her Friday evening before Justin had interrupted them. Justin. The thought of the way the head trainer had looked at Clara sent a wave of repulsion through his body. It wasn't that Justin was a bad guy, but this was Clara, his Clara, and he couldn't imagine her dating Justin. He was much older than her, for one thing, and Mason was pretty sure he'd just gone through a messy divorce. Kicking back the covers, he swung his legs out of bed and sat up, pausing for a moment to let his body adjust to the new position before he stood. So far, it hadn't been awkward working with her, but she had just started, and they hadn't been alone for very long. He needed to find time to speak to her about the past before it did get awkward. They had made it to the playoffs again this year, and he certainly didn't need to be distracted with the most important games ahead of them. He grimaced slightly when he rose to his feet. He'd twisted his ankle or something during practice on Friday, and though he'd iced it over the weekend, it was still tender. Clenching his jaw, he limped to the shower. Perhaps the hot water would help. The steam and heat from the water relaxed the muscles of his shoulders, but it did nothing for the pain in his ankle. As he toweled off, he knew he would have to wrap his ankle and hope no one noticed. Thankfully, he always kept medical tape in his bathroom for instances like these. Sitting on the bed, he wrapped the ankle, careful not to put the tape too tight. The last thing he needed was to lose circulation in the foot and cause an even greater injury. With that deed done, he pulled on clothes, grabbed his wallet, and headed toward the training facility. The sun was just rising as he pulled into the parking lot, sending brilliant oranges and purples across the sky. Mason hated getting up early, but he sure didn't mind getting to see the Texas sunrises. Though he'd only ever lived in Texas, he'd spent time in other states for games, and they just couldn't compare to a Texas sunrise or sunset. After turning the ignition off, he grabbed his bag and headed toward the front entrance. The pain in his ankle appeared to be less with the support of the tape, and he was fairly certain that he wasn't limping, which turned out to be a good thing because he reached the front door at the same time Clara did. He hadn't even seen her approaching, but he had been a little distracted by the sky. "Well, well, well," he said with a teasing lilt as he pulled the door open for her. "I guess you can't avoid me now." Her mouth dropped open in protest. "I haven't been avoiding you." He raised his brow at her. "Oh, really? The only time we spoke on Friday is when I sought you out." He pointed at himself when he emphasized I, and then to Clara with the word you. Her perfect pink lips pulled into a line before she shook her head. "Well, in case you hadn't noticed, I have been a little busy unpacking and trying to get settled." "It's because you can't handle my hotness, right? I mean, I didn't have these guns back when we dated." He flexed his arms, enjoying the smile that spread across her face. Clara rolled her eyes and swatted his arm. "Stop it! Don't be ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" Mason put on his best hurt puppy dog face. "Are you saying I'm not hot? That I've lost it since we dated?" "No, that's not what I'm saying at all." "So you're saying I never had it? I'm so hurt." He let his mouth fall open in mock hurt, but his eyes twinkled to let her know he was kidding. "No, Her words faltered and her face flushed as she realized he had caught her. Feeling just a bit sorry for her, he offered a reprieve. "It's good to see you smile again." "Thanks, you too." They stood there for a minute, both unsure of what to say next. Thankfully, or not so thankfully, Mason wasn't really sure which, Justin interrupted their moment. Again. This man was turning out to have the worst timing in history as far as Mason was concerned. "Ah, good. Clara, there you are. I've got the schedule for today, and I wanted to discuss game procedures, since this Sunday will be a game day." Clara nodded, her demeanor back to all business. "Guess I'll see you later," she said to Mason before following Justin down the hall. Mason watched her go, unable to keep his eyes from her and the way Justin looked at her, or the way his hand touched her lower back as he led her down the hall. Mason knew the man was looking for comfort, but he could only hope that Justin wouldn't find that comfort in Clara's arms. Pushing the door to the locker room open, he entered and dropped his bag on the bench. A moment later, the door opened again, and Blaine strode into the room. "I was looking for you. Coach wants to see you." "Me? What for?" All kinds of traitorous thoughts raced through Mason's head. Had they found out about his former relationship with Clara? Was he in trouble for talking to her? Had the coach seen his injury on Friday? Was he in trouble for not reporting it? Blaine shook his head. "I don't know. He just asked me to find you and send you his way. I'd suggest you don't keep him waiting, though. You know how he gets the week before games." Right. Coach had a tendency to be a little more high-strung and laser-focused the week leading up to a game, and Mason knew better than to keep him waiting. He finished stowing his stuff in the locker and then headed to face the music, whatever it was. The anxiety only grew the closer he got to the coach's office. Before knocking, he took a deep breath and tried to calm his racing heart. It would do no good to enter looking guilty before he knew what the meeting was even about. "Come in." The coach's deep voice came from the other side of the door. Mason pushed the door open and hoped he looked more confident than he felt. "You asked for me, Coach?" "I did. Have a seat." Coach pointed at the chair opposite his desk. "I watched the tape from practice on Friday." Mason's heart sank as he sat in the chair. This was about his injury then. He wasn't sure if that was the better of the two options or not. "Coach, I can explain." Coach held up his hand and fixed Mason with a silencing glare. "How bad is it, Dixon?" "It's not bad, Coach, really. I landed awkwardly on it, but I iced it all weekend. It's much better today." Mason tried not to squirm under the coach's penetrating stare. The man's gaze was like an intimidating lie detector. "Okay, well, I want you to see the new athletic trainer today. Have it looked at and taped up. And take it easy on that foot. We need you for Sunday's game." "Yes, sir." Relief flooded Mason as he stood. Yes, he might have to meet with Clara, but he was pretty sure he had just dodged a bullet in there. He returned to the locker room and changed into his practice gear before heading to find Clara. She was staring down at her desk when he knocked on the door. He must have startled her because her small jump sent the papers on her desk flying to the floor. Mason rushed over to help her pick them up. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." "No, it's fine. I was just focused and not expecting anyone for another hour." They each grabbed for the papers, their hands touching as they reached for the same one at the same time. His eyes locked with hers, and memories from their time together flooded him. He remembered the first time he held her hand. He had thought at the time that he'd been so suave, pretending to yawn and then placing the hand he covered his mouth with on top of hers. She had smiled, but said nothing, and he'd fallen even harder for her. He let go first, hoping to sever the memories as well as the connection he was feeling right now. Sorry. He picked up the rest of the papers that were out of her reach and placed them on her desk. It's okay. She stood after gathering her stack of papers. What are you doing here? Mason shrugged. Coach sent me to see you before practice. I twisted my ankle last Friday, and he wanted it checked out and taped up. He pointed down at his foot. However, I did that this morning. She raised an eyebrow at him and pointed to the bed that sat in her office. Well, if Coach wants me to take a look at it, you better sit down and let me see it. Mason took a deep breath as he walked to the bed. He hoped Clara wouldn't be able to see anything wrong. There was no way he was missing Sunday's game. After sitting, he untied his shoe and stretched his leg out. She started at his knee, her fingers probing down his leg. He tried not to flinch at her touch. It certainly didn't hurt, but it was igniting things in his body that he hadn't felt for years. He was so focused on the memories that he had stopped paying attention to where her fingers were until she pressed on something that sent a pain up his leg and forced him to jump and cry out in pain. Her eyes flicked to his, brimming with concern. That hurt? Just a little. He clenched his jaw to keep from showing her how much. I probably just need to ice it more. Mason, I don't think you should be running on this ankle. I'm not sure this is a twisted ankle, or even a strain or sprain. In fact, I'd like to get an MRI. I'm afraid you've injured your Achilles, or you might be developing tendinitis in it. What? No, I'm too young for that. There was no way he was getting an MRI. He knew what the recommendation for Achilles tendinitis was. Rest. And there was no way he was not playing. It's a simple sprain, that's all. Look, I'll take it easy today and soak it more tonight. After Sunday's game, we'll have another week off. That will give it plenty of time to heal. Clara was not convinced. That was evident by her pursed lips and folded arms. But he knew she wouldn't fight him on it. At least, not yet. He'd just have to tell the offensive line coach he needed to play conservatively and let his ankle heal. As long as it didn't get worse, he didn't think Clara would rat him out. At least, he hoped not,